where I see a bet there against a trial is a bet really against hope. And I don't think there is a tangible calculus that I can put around that to say how important it is for an individual on a trial, whether that trial succeeds or not, to have the hope that this is something that can prolong their life.
It's already hard enough for me to see data that's maybe not that great on a trial because those are people that didn't necessarily do very well. But then you're adding in an additional, let's bet on them.
Welcome to Cracking Cancer, where we tackle the tough questions about cancer with real patients and world experts. Our mission is to empower the cancer community through education, bring transparency to the oncology system, and drive funding for critical cancer research. Whether you're facing a diagnosis, supporting a loved one, or simply here to learn, we're here to bring clarity, hope, and action to the fight against cancer. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cracking Cancer. I am your host, Dr. Kyle Concannon. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that I never thought we would be talking about in a cancer education podcast, which is the concept of making bets on clinical trial outcomes. And joining me today are Samantha Murrell and Rob Swanda. I'll let you both go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Hey everyone, Samantha Murrell, patient advocate.
Hey everyone, Rob Swanda here, science communicator.
Well, thank you both for joining us. And Samantha, it was you that brought this whole concept to my attention, this idea. You know, we knew about Kalshi being around and sports betting platforms and things like that. And then the scope of other things you could bet on. But I didn't realize until recently that there was an opportunity to bet on the outcomes of clinical trials. And I think there's a ton of emotions that everyone is feeling right now with this new addition into our world that didn't used to be there. And Rob, maybe you can just start off by telling us what's going on. What's the background here?
Yeah, let me read it right from Kalshi's press release from July 16th of this year. Kalshi, the next generation financial exchange, today announced a partnership with public intelligence company Applied XL to launch a pilot suite of prediction markets on clinical trial outcomes and FDA regulatory decisions. The markets will create publicly available, accurate probabilities aiming to help solve drug development's information silo problem. So that's just the first part. I'll pass it to Samantha for some reactions, and then we can come back because there's some quotes in here from the CEO, from Applied XL that we can dive into also.
Yeah, so I was first informed about this when the New York Times article came out on this, and the journalists actually reached out to the Young Lung Cancer Initiative to kind of get their take on what they thought about it, because specifically, initially, it's going to be concentrating on lung cancer, breast cancer, and I believe lymphoma, and maybe another cancer I'm not remembering. But because it was related to lung cancer, they reached out. And I didn't even have a response, honestly. Like, I couldn't form a sentence because my initial thought was, what is the world coming to? Like, I understand betting on sports. You know, it's been around for forever. It's a thing. People enjoy it. Although I will say a lot of people go into hell of a lot of debt because of it too. But to add into the mix the fact that people are betting on FDA approval of trials that myself or someone else I know will be going on is an awful thought. And I was initially appalled at just FDA approval alone. And then I found out that it's also looking at endpoints. And endpoints, I feel like they're saying the word endpoints because they're trying to make people not realize what that means. And honestly, I didn't know what that meant until I looked at it in more detail. And it's essentially looking at progression-free survival and overall survival. You know, the comeback is, oh, it's a collection of people. It's not an individual person. So it's not like we're betting on an individual. But you kind of are, even if they're in a group. So you're essentially thinking to yourself, okay, so someone could put $1 million on the fact that they don't want this drug to be successful and I'm not going to live 6 months longer than I had planned. And they could make millions off of that. I just think there's a moral line there that just has to be drawn that we just shouldn't be doing. And I'm very, very, very upset about it.
So Samantha, I'm curious, you know, my take from a moral standpoint is pretty identical. I think what's lost here is the fact that on the flip side of that, there are people who are on these trials or people who are considering these trials. And on one hand, you have a bet that's against a progression-free survival. And a lot of these, they're saying, are going to be mostly phase 3 trials. So things that have already gone through a first in-human phase. So we know they're maybe safe. Then they go through phase 2. We know they're effective. And now phase 3 is we're asking, are these more effective than what we're already doing? And for many people who are suffering from cancers, what we're already doing is not good enough. Mm-hmm. That's why we do the phase 3 trial, is because what we have is insufficient and we need to do better. And where I see a bet there against a trial is a bet really against hope. And I don't think there is a tangible calculus that I can put around that to say how important it is for an individual on a trial, whether that trial succeeds or not, to have the hope that this is something that can prolong their life or prolong their progression-free time, which is the time that they would have without symptoms. And I think adding this whole layer in is adding in a negative consequence to patients that I'm not sure we fully reconcile the degree of harm that can cause.
Yeah, the mental toll is absolutely insane. I can't imagine being on a trial, being really excited for the opportunity and the potential, looking at past historical data on it, going on it, getting approved. And then maybe I happen to just look at an ad on Facebook or wherever these ads are. They're everywhere. And it says like, hey, bet on clinical trials. And there's a link and it somehow says that the clinical trial that you're on, everyone's betting against it or they don't have faith in it. And I can't imagine how impacting that could be on, well, is it even worth it? Why would I bother? It could very much sway someone to not go on it, which is terrifying when a drug could actually be doing pretty well and might give people more time. Can you imagine if suddenly people were saying, oh, I'm just not going to do a clinical trial because the data doesn't look good on Kalshi?
Yeah, I can imagine that. Well, and the interesting thing about these trials is a lot of times you'll put a trial out for a large group of people. And I'll give you an example. We're in lung cancer. And the first major pill for lung cancer, those were given to all patients with lung cancer. And then we found out from that trial that a small subset of those patients had mutations. And those patients did really well on this drug. And that's how we discovered really that if you have a certain mutation, like the one you have, Samantha, mm-hmm. we can have a certain drug that would work well for that. And the reason I bring that up is that trial, if you were betting on it, early data wasn't great mm-hmm. because it was in a bunch of people who weren't necessarily benefiting, but a small group of them benefited tremendously. Mm-hmm. And then it led to a whole explosion, really, of scientific advancement. Whereas if we were focused solely on the outcome of that trial and you had to make a bet, betting against it might have, in that context, been the appropriate call long-term if you didn't do any further digging, if you didn't learn anything from things not working as well as you had hoped. And that's where I worry with this kind of avenue here is, how much of our environment and ecosystem and the way we develop businesses and the way we look at long-term strategies for developments, have we fallen victim to a short-term mindset, a quarterly mindset? Now, if you adopt that into clinical advancement and scientific progression through clinical trials, and all of a sudden we're just saying, is it going to meet the first primary endpoint? And that's going to be an end goal for a lot of people. I worry that things are going to devolve very quickly.
Can you go into a little bit more about the primary endpoint terminology? I know I kind of hit it at a very high level, but people just genuinely have no idea what that means.
No, it depends on the trial, but most of the time for a phase 3 trial, you're looking at something like overall survival, meaning we have 2 arms. One arm of the trial are individuals who were usually randomized, so they may know what they're getting or they may not know what they're getting, but they're either getting the treatment that is the standard of care or the trial treatment. For example, you might be getting a chemo regimen that we would usually use or the study drug that we think is going to do better. And then we compare them. So we measure their tumors. And so people, I'll get into this a little later, but we should go into how those things are truly defined, because I think they may be influenced by this. But the people who are treating them will measure their tumors, they'll measure their symptoms, and then we'll say, how long did this person go before either their tumors grew by a certain amount, they developed a new tumor somewhere, and that would be a progression event. And there are clear criteria as to what defines that. And then to say how much did it grow, those kinds of things. And then there's overall survival, which does mean, did the patient die? And then we compare them across both of those arms. Did patients die sooner on the treatment arm, the new thing we're investigating, or did they die sooner on what we were using before? So that's usually, in another superficial, but again, for these phase 3 trials, the endpoints are usually pretty straightforward. You want it to be clear. And those are the things we're talking about here.
So how is that data reported? So is it reported to the FDA? Who is it reported to, and how are Cauchy able to grab that data?
So they must be using public data. They can't not. It would be very illegal for them to use data that is not yet public. But I'll tell you how that data is generated. So let's say I have a patient in my clinic, and I see there's a trial that we can offer them, and I have patients who are on phase 3 trials. Mm-hmm. I'll give you a great example. I have a patient who was qualifying for a trial. They had to have a certain biomarker. They had to have a high PD-L1. Mm-hmm. So this was an immunotherapy trial because immunotherapy targets PD-L1. We could either give them regular immune checkpoint inhibitors, the immunotherapies we tend to give, or they would get the trial drug. My patient enrolled in the trial. I don't know what they're getting. Mm-hmm. So I actually don't know if they're getting the regular immunotherapy or the trial immunotherapy. There are other phase 3 trials where I do know what they're getting. And then I measure the tumor myself. And I look at the scan and I say, it looks this big. And I write it down on a piece of paper by hand. And then at their next scan, I measure the same area, look at the same tumor, and I try to get it the same part of the scan, and I measure it. I write it down. I look, are there any new areas? Now, a lot of times there may be scan-to-scan variability. Samantha, you've experienced this in your scans, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. And whether we're calling something progression or not isn't always 100% clear. And this can come up because a lot of times the provider will measure the scans, but as a layer of, I would say, protection against bias, they also have many times radiologists who are not treating the patient read the scan. And the radiologist who's not involved with things will try to measure things to be unbiased. But it may be clear, what people are getting. So you are biased frequently. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that the individual who is measuring things, even if I don't know if they're on the study drug or not, if I am influenced by an external source telling me this trial is really good or this trial is really bad, we're biased to attribute something to something else. And I know so many examples where I have seen patients who are on a clinical trial and we are positive they got the trial drug, even though they're randomized. We don't know what they got, but they got the response we were expecting to see from the trial drug. And then we were really biased and we essentially act as though they're on the trial drug. And I can see a world where if I'm in there by hand measuring and, the tumor's a little fuzzy, the area isn't incredibly well defined, there's provider variability in how you're measuring these things. Am I measuring on the smaller range? Am I measuring a little bit on the wider range? If you compound that bias over 300 patients, I think you can get dramatically off effects personally. Or the things where we say, what is that little thing in the lung? I'm not really sure. Does it change how we act? Well, I heard people aren't really doing well on the study drug, or the odds were really low on the study drug. Let's just call that progression, get my patient off study. I can see that being a tool that we may use trying to be unbiased. But again, my number one goal is to advocate for the patient in front of me. The trial is not the number one goal in my life. So if I see that this trial looks like it's doing poorly, I think there's no way it's not going to bias my interpretation of their scans. And later we should get into my interpretation of their symptoms, because that's, I think, going to be really critical here. Mm-hmm. But that's how all this is derived. And then it gets bundled up by the drug company, and they submit it to the FDA. And the drug companies are trying their best to make this non-biased. They're not trying to couch their data. I'm pretty confident in that. But they receive their data from the providers, and then they bundle up what we tell them and they submit it to the FDA, and then it goes into review.
And Samantha, just to hit on the point where you were asking where they're pulling this data from. So Kalshi is working with a company called Applied XL, which is a public intelligence company. And they're pulling the information from clinicaltrials.gov, FDA approval letters, and advisory committee vote records.
Interesting. Rob, you should look into what that last bit means.
Yeah.
What does that last bit mean?
Because what that's sounding like to me is they're getting influence from expert reviews and experts in the field who, as one who works closely with experts in the field, I could tell you we're pretty biased.
And I'm also wondering, while you do that, Rob, like where the line is of who's allowed to bet and who isn't, right? So like I did read patients on the clinical trial are not allowed to bet. Oh, well, thanks. Geez. But like, where do you draw that line? Is it physicians? Is it pharmaceutical companies? Is it friends of doctors? Is it friends of pharmaceutical industry people? Like,
yeah, no, I think that those are great questions, and it's definitely not all answered in the press release that Kalshi put out there, but they did touch on it briefly. And basically, they said that employment verification will be required. So Kalshi will require employment verification for all traders in these markets as an additional integrity measure. But that's all I saw on this press release that alluded to some type of, trying to minimize who can come in if you are part of the trial, if you work for this company, if you're a provider, whatever. There may be more details out there, but that's all they said.
Which is insane because Joe the farmer could have an aunt who works
at the pharmaceutical
company, and they uploaded they're a farmer and they bet $3 million. I mean, and they'll share the profits with the aunt because she knew. Like,
right.
Yeah, I think the risk is really, really high here because first of all, they try to get away from some of the ambiguity of clinical trial development, I think, by sticking to phase 3s. But the downside of phase 3s is they're usually global. So you have, in any given large pharmaceutical company, you're probably going to have sites all over the world. And people within those sites are going to know data, in the phase 1, the phase 2. The reality for a lot of these clinical trials is you're actually choosing how many patients you're enrolling. You're choosing which sites. You're doing all these things really with a specific goal in mind. They want their drug to be approved. So I think they've done a lot of the math. I mean, nowadays, most phase 3s probably are successful because of how good we are at the statistics and planning them. That's why they can use a lot of the data from phase 1 and phase 2 to say, how well are these people doing in these certain contexts? How many would we need to do? How well would we expect the people in the other arm to do? And we can do all that modeling. So I think all to say that there's a lot of hands that are involved with planning the trials. So there's a lot of communication that could go out that we wouldn't be privy to between family members, friends, other people in the company disseminating what they've heard, in the water cooler, that can give people in the public a sense of comfort around a bet that the lay public would not know. And then beyond that, Samantha, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about how the patient advocacy groups, how that network will influence trial betting and maybe enrollment or something based on all this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just feel like maybe you're in an advocacy group and someone posts something, hey, I saw this bet on a lung cancer drug, and that person that posted it didn't know that anyone was on it, right? In the group, and then they happen to be, and like the cascading effects of that. I don't know, it's terrifying to me. And the thing that also came to my mind related to influence and things like that is, what happens if you have competitors in the space? There are, and a lot of markets, right? They're competing for all having first line drug, things like that. Who says that drug company isn't going to bet against their competitor's drug trial to sway the probability results on Kalshi? And maybe that's conspiracy theory, Samantha, going way down a rabbit hole. But like, can you just imagine if someone betted $5 million to try and sway the numbers to make it look like it's not actually that great, to sway people from not going on the trial?
Is that how these betting markets work? Is they, based on the amount of bets that go in for a certain outcome, the probability of that outcome is weighted?
Oh, I don't know. I'm just saying, like, someone could bet that amount of money to sway something. I'm not necessarily saying that like $5 million versus $500 would do that. I hope not. Anyway,
well, I don't know. I mean, it might be how they work. I like genuinely don't know.
And similar to that, Samantha, I was kind of thinking about it in the way if like a newer company was coming into the market and maybe they have this breakthrough therapeutic and it's the only one that might enter the market for them, but are people not going to bet on it because it's a brand new innovation that actually may change the field, but they're more familiar with these larger pharma companies who have these big brand names, a lot more employees who could potentially be involved in providing information if that does end up happening. So I don't know. I feel like it's a little unfair too to some of those newer players who are coming in with these great ideas, and it's almost like they're giving an unfair advantage.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I know for a fact that so you kind of have two buckets of people doing these bets, right? You have the college kid who's trying to make a quick $5,000 because someone on Instagram said that you can, turn around some money real quick. So they're just like throwing money at whatever their gut is telling them, right? And then you have the literal math statisticians that this is their full-time job, where they're throwing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on bets because they're statistically analyzing it. And I'm like, okay, I get like soccer, whatever, right? Those two buckets of people come into play, but like there are no implications of that. Whereas you've got these two buckets of people betting on such an important thing, like having the random college kid just throwing money wherever, like that could very much kilter something in the wrong direction, and then the public perception could be not great. And it's kind of terrifying that a college kid could change the outcome of a clinical trial in terms of its probability.
Well, and it does seem like at least my understanding of this seems correct, that the more people that bet on a particular outcome, the odd of that outcome increases on the platform.
Okay.
So it is weighted by the amount of money that's put into it.
Okay.
And
so that's even worse.
So to your point, and where I worry is you see, let's say, like you're mentioning, let's say someone's on the trial and they're in an advocacy organization, and then they post a progression, and then someone else posts that they've progressed. So you have functionally this insider information, but you're not hearing about the people who are doing well. Like people aren't countering that usually, or like these are the things that people are going to be vocal about more likely. So your perception and what you're seeing is negatively skewed. And does that mean you're going to see bets in the trial that are negatively skewed? Because that gets posted, that's what the public sees. And if people are betting on this, they're going to be mining data. And this is public data. Although, insider information, of some individuals who are progressing on it, and they can say, hey, I just started this 2 months ago and I'm progressing. And, how is that going to influence because that happens on every trial. How is that going to influence the betting on the trial people? And then you see the betting, and that's going to influence the statistical probabilities associated with each outcome. And that's going to influence people going on the trial. The trial stops enrolling or has decreased enrollment, including maybe from the providers who are saying, oh, this is a 15% odds of being yes, so maybe we don't want to accept this trial. And then by no fault of their own, like the trial has to close. And the trial does fail because you didn't meet, your enrollment criteria.
And we haven't talked about influence and threats and things like that. So you two haven't seen the documentary yet about Kalshi, and it's on Netflix. I encourage everyone to take a look at it. It essentially talks about how this is just one example where so people are actually betting on the number of missiles that are being fired and landing in whatever country in the Middle East, right? And so, although they preface that they do not allow bets on death markets, but I just want to preface that because they very much said, we do not allow bets on death markets, which we should get to in a little bit because I feel like this is skirting that line. But anyway,
these are those peaceful missiles that we're firing.
Right.
I see.
And so a journalist reported that a missile had exploded somewhere and people had reported it. It was like very early on. He reported it because people said they were there. They saw whatever happened. And he reported it. And so that bet closed, whether it be on Polymarket or Kalshi, I can't remember, one of them. And then he started to receive threats. Threats against him and his family, that he needed to change his story. He needed to rewrite his article, his post or whatever it was, to say that actually there was no missile and he was mistaken, and that millions of dollars were at stake, and that he had to essentially rewrite, otherwise his family might be killed. And he obviously refused, and so that's kind of the end of the story there. But I guess what I'm getting at is, if people are betting millions of dollars, which they are, on outcomes, and the outcome is not reported the way that they want it to be, it's kind of terrifying to think about doctors, site clinical lead coordinators, whomever, that are very clearly associated with the trial. You know, their names are everywhere. It's not hard to find. How those people could potentially get threats. They could get coerced. You know, if someone was telling me that they were going to kill my husband, and I took it seriously, would I skew something? Would I measure something a little differently? I don't know. But those threats are very, very serious and very scary to think about.
No, and particularly, I love this perspective because it's one I didn't think about. You know, for an individual who is losing a loved one from cancer and is, let's say, I don't know how they're reconciling, is the spouse of the person on a trial not able to bet? Like, I don't know how they're going to figure that out. So I imagine that's fine. And then the patient dies and the trial fails. And then, you know, they bet so much money on this because all their hope was around this anyway. Mm-hmm. And then what have they got to lose? And you can imagine a situation where people who are in such pain and have experienced such loss, and we see this in medicine where people do lash out at the people who have run the trials. And I've seen trials that are one arm, the treatment arm, the thing you're investigating is numerically better. It looks totally better. But it was underpowered, we call it, meaning, you know, you had 200 patients in one arm, 200 patients in the other arm, and this one was better. But we have to use statistical modeling to say how confident are we that result is true. So you see examples where one is better than the other one, but we can't say it with statistical certainty or high statistical confidence. So we'll still call that negative. It wasn't positive enough, or we didn't have enough patients in it. If you had 250, that would have been positive, even with the numbers looking the exact same. So I can see situations where you have these gray areas, and then someone loses so much over really something that is somewhat of a statistical technicality. Mm-hmm. And, you know, who are they going to get mad at? They're not going to get mad at the betting market. Right. And the interesting insight behind that is the individual largely who's on the podium presenting the results from these big trials is not usually the person who came up with the trial idea. It's not usually the person that interrogated the data. They didn't interpret the data. A lot of it is maybe they enrolled the most out of anywhere. So there are 50 clinicians who could equally have been the first author on the podium, but they enrolled the most. Or maybe they started, the process earlier than other ones and did a good job enrolling, and, now they're up there. But they're not the one who made the call. So I think I could see a lot of misplaced blame and anger and hurt around this. I really didn't think about that angle, but I think you're totally right.
Can I read the statement from Kalshi's CEO and see and get reactions from that?
Please.
So again, in their press release, I just want to highlight where they were coming from, or at least what's interpreted from this on the positive aspects of why this is coming to the market. So the CEO of Kalshi said, drug development is one of the most important and most information constrained industries on earth. The data that determines which drugs advance and which don't is largely locked away from the people who need it most. Surfacing information is what Kalshi is for, and we are committed to doing it right. Compliance first, carefully scoped, and built for the long term. Any reactions for where Kalshi is going in that positive skew statement?
Samantha, what do you think?
I mean, I talked to my husband a few days ago, just trying to be that other perspective of really trying to understand where they're coming from. And you and I, we all talked about this before the podcast, but I saw a med student had posted something that was in favor of it, which blew my mind. But essentially, it was saying like it's better to have more data out there, and it will inform patients more. And I just say BS. Like it's a bunch of marketing lingo. I'm in the tech space. It's a bunch of BS. And they're trying to pitch it as better for the people, when at the end of the day, it's better for them to get more money and revenue.
Yeah, I share the concern. I don't know what transparency they're arguing that they're bringing. I can see an argument that one could make about knowing which clinical trials are around. But the reality is we don't know how they're going to go until the trial is done, until it's finally read. And many people may not know this, but when a trial is accruing and as it's going along, we usually have these kind of pause points where we'll take a look and you'll see, okay, how are people doing? And this is an internal group where we're not usually privy to this. But if there's a safety signal, meaning people are doing way worse than we thought they would do on that treatment arm, they'll stop the trial early. So there are these internal corrections that are already there, and appropriately, we're not privy to them because of the bias that this may include. So we don't get day-to-day updates because of all the biases we were just talking about. People aren't going to be put on, or you hear all these people where their tumors shrunk down miraculously, and who knows, maybe they were on the standard of care arm, but they say, oh, I'm positive I was on the trial arm because it worked so well. So I think this idea that we're going to increase transparency is inherently flawed, because this is an area where you cannot have transparency until it's read out. It would be wrong to do that. So what prediction modeling is making these numbers, I'm curious to better understand that, because if we knew the answer, we wouldn't do the trial. So, and if it was known to be harmful, we would stop the trial. So I'm not sure what transparency we're talking about here. It's not the transparency of the outcome, because you know that when the trial's over, not before.
Yeah, and it's not like suddenly Kalshi's going to show the requirements for the clinical trial onboarding and all of the like. That's not going to be there. They're not going to have that there. So like, how is that helpful to me as a patient? I get the argument of the layman person who doesn't have cancer. They now suddenly have awareness of maybe a drug that people didn't know about. They learn what progression-free survival and overall survival is, but like, why would that benefit anyone? I hope people that never get cancer never know what that is, right? Like, why why does the general population need to know that? And when they are impacted by cancer, they're going to do a hell of a lot of research and figure out what drugs are available, get first opinions, second opinions, third opinions, and get it figured out. Like, why would it being on a betting site help you be more informed?
Right. And I think, imagine a world where all clinical trials are on this, right? And what they're going after is largely does it meet its primary endpoint, which could be progression-free survival or overall survival. That does not say how effective the drug is.
Right.
It doesn't, that's not what that is.
Yep.
So you can have a highly, highly effective drug in a very poorly, poorly designed trial, and that trial may be negative. And I think that's a really, really hard thing to reconcile when you're the one that's going to be looking at these markets. You didn't do trial design, right? Like, but if the thing you're comparing against is too strong, or sometimes we have the other arm does exceedingly well, we don't know why, but in that, something about the patient population was skewed in that trial. We see that. We also see trials where, and this happens all the time, where the comparator arm, they get it FDA approved, they get it approved just to do this trial. And then right after that approval, a better treatment comes along. We have a trial that I think probably meets this criteria now because the pace of clinical research is so quick in certain areas. And that's a good thing, but that means a trial will be positive because the other arm is old, it's antiquated. We shouldn't be giving those other things anymore. And does that mean the investigational drug is outstanding? Well, no. It just means that the thing they were comparing it to isn't what we would give anymore. So there's so many flawed ways to interpret what you're going to be seeing that I think is going to influence patient decisions and steer them away from trials they would really benefit from, and possibly toward trials that are just designed to meet positive endpoints and not designed for improving clinical care.
And there's something in the Kalshi press release that it's only my interpretation, but I'm worried that it could be rooted in anti-science or anti-pharma roots because of this quote that was made from somebody from the Applied Excel, so the partner that's with Kalshi. And I just want to read it and see if anybody else feels similarly from that. So they had a different stance, and they said, clinical trial results are rarely handed to you cleanly. They come out in pieces, scattered across registries, regulatory filings, and company statements. And the press releases often put a favorable spin on what the data actually shows. Resolving a market means reconciling all of that back to the primary source, which is what we built Applied Excel to do. So what I fear is that they are almost saying they're going to bring the information to the people, that there's information that's hidden. We're going to put that out in the open, when really, as we talked about before, they're using information that's publicly available. But the stance that they're taking worries me that it's coming from an anti-pharma rooted cause.
I mean, when I hear that, here's what I think. Here's what it sounds like to me. Trust us, not your doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I happen to actually know like a good deal about the trials that we're running. And I happen to know the other phase data that came out. And to boil down, do I think you're going to get clinical benefit is a very different question from what the prediction markets are saying, which is the trial going to be successful? You can get dramatic benefit from negative trials. Sometimes we see tails on these curves, meaning you can get people who are potentially cured. But if that's 15% of people, the trial may still be negative, even, because not many people derived a dramatic benefit. Would I say that that was a failed drug? 100% no. That is these can be game changer drugs, but a prediction market will have a completely different interpretation of that. So I worry that they're answering a question and providing what kind of sounds like medical advice in a very, very skewed lens based on a mathematical calculus rather than a biologic one.
I was going to say what you just said, Kyle, too, about how sometimes the drug will show promise in a small subset of population, but it could still be deemed as a negative. I wonder, too, with the idea of us repurposing drugs, especially in the rare disease space. So, of course, here we're talking about cancer, but sometimes for conditions where there are only a very small population of individuals that have a disease, they rely actually on drugs that have been approved for vastly different conditions to try to see if they have effects on benefiting that individual with a specific rare disease. So if we saw that a trial failed for a cancer drug, but we want to repurpose it maybe for this rare disease, is that actually going to deter people away? Because now all of a sudden, oh, it failed on Kalshi, people lost money, it's not going to provide any benefit. And now we're actually limiting further these individuals who do have rare diseases, who already can't get any treatments. They're just going to have less options available.
Yeah, or the amount of confidence that a patient would have if this is where they will go to get distilled data around how confident they should be in a drug or a medicine. Because, I mean, to your point, not only do we take medicines and apply them in rare concepts, but we can have negative trials that, as I was mentioning before, had a very, very positive element within them, but the trial itself failed. For example, if we took all of our lung cancer patients and had 10 trials, and each trial had a different inhibitor to it, a different type of targeted medicine, probably all 10 of those trials would fail. However, if you figured out the right subgroup, and then we only gave people with HER2 mutant lung cancer the medicine Samantha's on, each of those individual trials would be overwhelmingly successful. So there's so much data that is and information that's lost in the general distilling of all these things to a yes or no odds decision. And a lot of times you can tease out trials, and you'll see this if you look at the clinical trial manuscripts and the papers that come out. They'll look at subgroups and they'll say, oh, if we took only patients that had this feature or patients that only had this molecular detail, and we looked at those patients, some of these patients do much better. So even in trials that fail, we'll find subgroups of patients within those trials and change our practice patterns accordingly, and those may inform the next trials. Well, if those inform the next trials and you're part of that next trial group, you're going to look and see the first trial failed. I highly doubt you're going to, pay out of pocket for the trial publication, because you have to do that these days. And then you're going to go through and look, does my molecularly defined tumor elements, does that match up in here? And is that what they use to no, you're not going to do that. So I worry there's just so much nuance that goes into this stuff. And boiling it down is really what you're asking was their statistical approach sufficient or not? That's largely what this comes down to. We're losing a lot.
And I will say to what you said, Rob, I don't know, sometimes I see data from trials and I'm like, I don't know, man. In terms of I don't know, maybe they're underreporting, overreporting. It just seems a little bit, I'm not so sure there, right? I'll compare, trial data sometimes to actual people that I know, right? And things like that. And I'm like, this isn't making sense kind of thing, right? But to Rob, to the statement that they said, where they're we'll bring more information or whatever. I'm like, okay, so you're saying that maybe pharmaceutical companies are potentially not swaying, I don't know what the right word is, but
spinning,
buffering up whatever the data is or whatever. How would a betting company relay better data than what they're reporting? Because they're not part of the trial. They're not going to make up data. So how are they saying they're going to make it more transparent? Because they're only pulling the data that is available publicly. So I'm a little bit confused on how they're saying that they can be more transparent.
I'm wondering if they're trying to refer to the fact that they have a large platform, so they're able to get this information out to people. Maybe they're trying to claim that they're better communicators about this than some of the pharma companies are. I don't know. It's a great point, because you're right. I'm wondering if they're trying to rely on the fact that they do have this brand presence, they do have this following, that is why they're alluding at the fact that they are the better representative to transpire this information.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because if the idea is that iterative betting changes the outcomes because more people are betting yes to no, the probabilities sway, and that's how I think it works. If that's the theory, then you have to be relying on insider information here. Like, the only informed opinion that is going to sway that in the appropriate direction is one that should not be on that platform, right? So, like, if you know of a positive element to a trial and you're betting, it's because you yourself are on it. You know someone's on it. You're putting people on it. You've seen stuff from the company that's protected, something like that. Other than that, where would you be getting this informed opinion from? So I'm concerned about that.
I'm just wondering, like, also, where are they deciding what clinical trials to highlight and which ones not to highlight? I mean, there's hundreds, thousands of clinical trials all the time. And so I'm just wondering, how are they ranking these? I know, Samantha, you said in the beginning, the subset that they're starting out with, but are they eventually going to go into all different types of conditions and diseases? And like, where do they decide that this one is good to let people to bet on? And we're just going to let this one, nobody needs to bet on that. I don't know. It'll be interesting.
As one of the people that helps design trials, and we run the trials and we give input to the individuals who are making the calls and the drug companies who are sponsoring them, it's kind of horrifying to think that my input around, or an expert clinician's input around what a trial enrollment criteria should be and all these things can be swayed toward, well, how can we be the most confident this is going to be a positive trial, rather than, is this the most informative thing we can do? We fight with that now. A lot of times, and that's what I was talking about, that comparator arm. I'll give you an example. At the last ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, there was a 7-year outcome thing for a trial in ALK-driven lung cancer, where this medicine called lorlatinib did really, really, really well compared to its comparator called crizotinib. And the reality of that is crizotinib was developed years and years and years before lorlatinib, and no one nowadays would use crizotinib, and that's been true for maybe a decade. So the trial you're looking at, the comparator is just not in the realm of reality anymore. So I can just see how all of this gets so swayed. One element we haven't talked about, Samantha, that I would really love to hear your thoughts on is, we've been talking about primary outcomes, progression-free survival, overall survival. Patients can also be taken off of trials because of symptoms. And not all symptoms are objective. Abdominal pain, fatigue, nausea. There are a lot of symptoms that I can't measure. You just have to tell me. And if it's intolerable, we stop. And that can be a good enough reason to come off the trial. You don't have to be progressing. I'm curious to hear how, Samantha, you think the betting platform can affect people's subjective assessment of their symptoms on a trial.
I mean, I'm really psychosomatic. So if I'm reading, Kyle knows this all too well. So if I'm reading a trial isn't maybe doing too well, and I am feeling some pains or twinges or something, am I going to amplify that up in my head and thinking that it's actually worse than it is because I'm seeing that people are not in favor of this drug? Samantha would. I don't know about other people, but I very much would. So it worries me a lot in terms of that, but also the fact of people reporting their side effects and whether doctors actually take down that as a side effect. Because if they're swayed or if they have a bet on something, they're going to be like, oh, no, it's not a side effect. Don't worry about it.
I'm happy you brought that up, because one thing a lot of people don't know is when we're reporting the side effects that individuals have on a trial, we have to attribute it. do I think that side effect is due to the drug or do I think it's due to something else? If my cousin, spouse, loved one, someone I know is betting on the trial, well, the fact that you were vomiting up blood may have been, I don't know, you had gastroenteritis. It could have been something else. And I'm not even saying that it would be directly malicious by the person attributing the drug, but I could see a world where, let's say I'm the one doing that. If I believed so strongly in this drug, I may be biased into just not believing that it's going to cause that symptom. And people don't appreciate these subtle biases can sway things over so many patients. But yeah, I mean, another thing that people don't realize necessarily is that if you're looking at a trial development from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, and now we're in phase 3, there will be the safety data from the earlier phases. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to apply to you, because a lot of times we adapt. We may say, oh, nausea was really bad in the phase 2 study. We had enough patients to really identify it. Now we're going to add on this medicine in the phase 3. So your nausea would actually be a lot less because we knew about it. It's clear, the data is clear. So you may not experience that nausea that they experienced, or maybe all of these symptoms happened, but they just happened once after the first dose lasted for 2 days. That still counts. That's going to be read out in the trial. So all these things can negatively influence someone's ideas of what it's going to be like to be on this. And then you see, 15% on whatever betting platform. Yeah, Samantha, I'm curious how you'd integrate that.
Honestly, my default reaction, side note, is who says they're not going to start betting on side effects?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's reported,
yep, it's objective. We calculate
I would
it.
see that as a progression to endpoints and FDA approval side effects.
Well, and it very much is, because there are many drugs that are really efficacious, meaning they kill cancer, but they're incredibly toxic.
Mm-hmm.
And
they're going to listen to this, and then next month there's going to be a press release what you just said, Samantha, about an expansion to this betting platform. So people heard it here first.
Yeah.
I mean, again, like let's go back to the statement of they don't allow death markets, right? Like, to me, betting on endpoints is a death market. Like, how do you sway that as not?
Well, and to be more specific and concrete about that, so we grade our events. So you have, grade 1 nausea, mild nausea, you don't need anything, that kind of stuff. And then grade 5 events are death.
Yeah. Did
you have a inflammation of the lung or diarrhea? And if that was grade 5, I mean, that side effect from the medicine directly led to the demise of that patient. Mm-hmm. So are you betting on deaths or are you betting on grade 5 events? That may end up being a reality of these. Yeah. That's a really scary thought. And we have, those are real considerations in our trials. When we have side effects that affect the heart and side effects that affect the lungs, those can lead to deaths. We don't say in the list out of adverse events, it doesn't say death. It will say pneumonitis or inflammation of the lung, grade 5, 2 patients. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes that may be enough to end a trial early. But if you have enough patients and you have to figure it out, it's case by case there. But I could see that being a betting thing where, do you think there's going to be grade 5 pneumonitis? Mm-hmm. And that's a very sterile way of introducing, I suppose, a death market.
I mean, I get annoyed at clinical data as it is, because I'm like, these are people, right? Like, oftentimes when data is read out by doctors, I understand it's very monotone or whatever, and like you're reading it, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, these are people. These are individuals that committed their time to a trial, and you're talking about them like they're data points. And I'm not saying there's any other whimsical way to say it, right? Like, I understand you can't like start saying Susan and Sally and Jeff, right? But like, these are people. And so it's already hard enough for me to see data that's maybe not that great on a trial, because those are people that didn't necessarily do very well. But then you're adding in an additional, let's bet on them.
Yeah.
It is just...
Well, and adding on that, when I'm proposing a clinical trial to patients, I use the same terminology I used here, which is, we don't know that this is better, but we think it is. That's why we're doing the trial. That's why we're offering you an alternative. I'm offering additional hope benchmarked against what we had.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, really hard to see a world where we're betting against that. This is coming full circle to what we started with, but it really, I think even just talking about this over the last hour has better framed my thinking around it. That now when I'm in the seat and I believe that a trial may be better for a patient and they look and they see 20%, a prediction likelihood of this being a successful trial, that's not true. Like, that's not the reality of how it may play out. That's just what the betting market is doing. So it's going to be really hard to reconcile what I'm saying, like, hey, I really think this could be a great treatment for you. Let's put you on the trial. And to me, I have to sell that because I am asking them to go out of their way. They're going to collect extra blood draws. They're going to do scans in a certain regimen. They're getting a treatment that is not tested necessarily in this environment. There's a lot of stuff that this patient has to do. And I need to believe in the trial in order to recommend it. And I hope that they believe in it too, or else why would they do it? And there is an element of people are doing this truly selflessly to advance our scientific knowledge. And for that, we're eternally grateful. And there's a lot of patients who do say, I'll do whatever I can if it helps someone else. But that's a very, very different element than looking in our dynamic together and then looking at this prediction market. That's like, how do you reconcile? Oh, it says 20%, but you just told me you think this could be a great drug. It looks like nobody thinks this is a great drug. So I'm really worried about what that's going to do, and it's happening now.
And maybe we're wrapping up, I'm not sure, but I do want to add that I don't know if you've seen this, Rob, on socials, but like, no one is talking about this. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's because doctors just didn't see the article. They're not being told about it, but there are a lot of doctors on social media, and I've persuaded one to talk about it, and then another one just happened to do it. But other than that, no one is talking about it. And I would think that this would be a very hot topic. Like, I would think Good Morning America would at least have a segment on this. And there has been crickets. And I am very perplexed. I know that these prediction market companies have a lot of influence. They have a lot of money, their sponsorship, their political ties. I'm not going to go into it, right? But I'm just very confused.
Well, yeah, I bet that it would take over 2 weeks for it to pick up. So, no, that's a joke. No, I frankly, I didn't know about it until you brought it up. This didn't. Yeah. A lot of times, I think this happens. Like a lot of the other kind of social stuff that we talk about on here is, I learned, my head's in the sand with all the laboratory stuff and the clinical work and all these kinds of things that, these things only make it to me when they're brought up by you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm happy you did bring it up, because it's so funny that a lot of the people that are like directly probably have the ability to influence this, like the healthcare providers. We don't know about it until it's brought up to us, from the patients.
Yeah, even the drug companies, I'd be shocked that they even know that their names are up on Kalshi right now.
I haven't seen it either, Samantha. So just reiterating your point until you brought it up to me. And then it's interesting because Kalshi does have like a pretty strong, or at least I think strong, like influencer market where I've seen influencers talk about Kalshi. I've seen commercials while I'm streaming something, talk about Kalshi YouTube commercials. So to Kyle's point, maybe it will just take 2 weeks or so, but like, it might be coming. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, and I would have flipped the question a little bit. Is there any element around clinical trial development that you think is, I don't want to even say ethical, but you think would be appropriate to bet on, even if you find it personally unethical?
I mean, none of it's ethical, in my opinion. I would argue that if you really wanted to go there out of anything, it would be FDA approval in terms of like, I believe I saw one the other day that said like FDA approval for this drug in 2026.
So right? Like timelines.
So you're voting on whether it will be this year or next year. Okay. I mean, not the best, but like, okay. Again, I still think there's a lot of sway that can be done there, and bias, but it's the endpoint one that really irks me. And it's only going to get worse.
It's interesting to think about it because I think as these betting markets are getting bigger and bigger, they will hopefully, if they take input from us, being the medical community, the patient community, I think the impetus is somewhat on us to provide some alternative to what we find very distasteful. And, and I think, can you separate elements of drug development from the patient outcome? Because there are, out of preclinically, there's a lot of ways you could do it. There's all these compounds that look promising. Which one are they going to advance? I don't know. That, you could bet on that. I wouldn't feel that's terribly unethical.
That's exactly where my mind was going to, Kyle. I was thinking, like, what if there was something saying, like, we currently have no option for this type of cancer or this disease. Who do you think is going to be the first one to bring something to phase 1?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Or, in phase 3, we do tons of combination trials where we add different drugs together. Which of these will be, the first that is run in a phase 3? Mm-hmm. And that could, I agree with you. These are still going to be biasing the field in a way that I think is probably improper to include. But at least, it's if it's going to happen, I think we've got to figure out some alternative to betting against hope, mm-hmm. and betting against people's lives. Yeah. And maybe there is a way where you can bet on variations of development and variations of what trials may come out there and separate that from their respective endpoints, hoping they could all do well regardless of what the outcome of the bet is. If you're saying, does drug A or B get into phase 3 first? They can both be wildly successful regardless of how that bet does.
A bunch of people said to me that anyone betting on these endpoints, when they win money, should be forced to donate it to cancer research, which I loved.
Part of me feels like the individuals who are going to be betting on these are not the same individuals that are going to be philanthropically donating.
100%. And if it did all go to cancer research, they certainly wouldn't bet on it, right? But
I will say, if anyone wants to prove me wrong and donate to the Concannon laboratory, we can have a conversation. I'm happy to be proven wrong. But no,
I was just going to say that maybe if there's any positive that gets taken out of this, because I don't see it getting taken down or not proceeding forward, is there a way that they could educate people on what's going on? Make people more aware that these conditions are affecting millions of individuals, that there's no treatments available, like raising awareness. Do I think that that's going to happen? Probably not. But would that potentially help with what they're doing? I don't know. If they could highlight advocacy groups, if they could highlight the fact that these conditions affect X number of people every year, I don't know, bringing some type of awareness would at least make me feel a little bit happier about what they're doing.
Yeah. How quickly are they going to enroll? Those would be other elements that I think wouldn't be. But yeah, to your point, Rob, in order to meet their mission of increasing knowledge in the greater community, you have to provide the knowledge of what you're referring to, rather than just a public gestalt of where people are betting. Who knows? Right now we're having a very negative lens out of our, I think, very appropriate concern of how this is going to roll out and the consequences that may happen. But, hopefully they get ahead of that and they have some protective factors, and maybe they'll prove us wrong. Maybe they will incorporate things in ways that we don't anticipate. But we'll see. I agree. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think the most we can do is guide it in areas that we find a little more tasteful. But we'll see. My bet's out. I don't know. All right. I think that's probably as good a place to cut it as any. I don't have any final sentiments to add anyone. I don't know. Usually we have a bit here where it's like, hey, any last words for people who are thinking about betting on phase 3 trials? I don't know the equivalent for today's message, but Samantha, well, I'm going to put it on you anyway. Any sentiments for individuals who are trying to reconcile this new knowledge that you can bet on a trial that you're on?
No, really. I got nothing.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been Cracking Cancer. All right. We'll see you all again next time. And you can go to crackingcancer.org for more information. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Cracking Cancer. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, and visit crackingcancer.org for more information. Every dollar we earn goes directly to furthering the podcast and supporting vital cancer research. Because together, we can crack cancer.